So I'm going to attempt something this morning that has, as far as I know, never been attempted before in the history of civilization. And that is, I'm going to simultaneously address this group, the Wild Fox Sangha, and also a class on eco-spirituality at the Chaplaincy Institute of Maine. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about eco-spirituality this morning, and there's a large overlap between Zen and eco-spirituality that I kind of I don't know how much I'll be exploring, but we can talk about it in the question period a little bit. But I'm also speaking to an audience that are not Zen Buddhists, that are I don't know what they are. Some may be Christians, some may be atheists, and other things. So with that said, I want to kind of try as best I can to make this a non-affiliated talk. Okay, which goes to really my first point about eco-spirituality. Eco-spirituality has no dogma. It has no rules. It has no set of required beliefs. It has no beliefs at all, actually. It has no religious or spiritual affiliation. Although people that get involved in eco-spirituality may come from any of a number of different spiritual paths. Using a Zen term, we would say that eco-spirituality arises from not knowing. Not knowing being the opposite of having preconceptions, established beliefs, dogmatic approaches, and hopefully that in each second, in each moment is fresh and new. And we are able to experience that kind of that cleanliness of the moment directly without being contaminated by all of our narratives, our preconceptions, our biases, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, that's not easy. And so that's kind of a goal, as it were. And those of you who are Zen Buddhists know that's a thing that we practice constantly and fail frequently at doing. But as best we can, we want to come from that perspective of not knowing. And again, that's not negation. That's the freshness and clarity of each moment, uncontaminated by all our stuff up here. Okay. The second point that I'd like to make is that often our discussions on subjects such as these are confounded by semantics. When I talk about eco-spirituality, there are two terms in particular that I will use from time to time. One is to talk about the divine, and another is to talk about presence. And those are very loaded terms, but those are kind of, in a sense, the least loaded terms that I can come up with for talking about certain ineffable experiences that we encounter when we make a deep and intimate connection with wildness. But ultimately, language fails us. As in Zen, we know that. We know that language cannot capture the fundamental experiences that we also call things like Buddha nature or Buddha mind. The words simply cannot go there. and they always fall short. And yet, in order to communicate with one another, in order to talk about these things, we need to use words. And that's why it's often said that Zen teachers are always liars, because we're always using language in a way that's inadequate to approximate a reality that is beyond words. A famous Zen teacher back in the 5th or 6th century, Bodhidharma, talked about Zen as a teaching that's beyond words and meanings, direct pointing to the human mind. Well, eco-spirituality is beyond words and meanings. It is a direct experience, a direct encounter. So as soon as we start talking about it, we're kind of desecrating it to a certain extent. But again, we need to talk. So I use those terms, the divine and presence in certain contexts, and others may prefer other words. Some people talk about God, some about goddess, some about Gaia. There are many, many, many terms for that ineffability, that thing that is beyond, that experience that bowls us over, and yet we cannot put it into words. And so I have a certain tendency to just want to dismiss it all and say, okay, it doesn't matter what you call it. Why are you, if you are a Christian and this ties to your belief in Jesus and to your practice and worship as a Christian, so be it. If you're a Hindu and it applies to your concepts and worship as a Hindu, so be it. I think that we have the ability and the flexibility to plug this eco-spiritual perspective into our lives, no matter what our spiritual predispositions are. So I also want to talk a little bit about why this is important. Because my feeling is that through eco-spiritual practice, we develop intimacy, we develop relationship, we develop closeness. And out of those things, we cultivate respect, caring, relationship, connection, which are critical. If we as humans are going to alter our course of destruction, if we're going to create a new relationship with the world that surrounds us, a relationship that's based on a positive synergy, not a path of destruction, then we need that connection. We need that relationship. It's just like a relationship with another human being. If we truly care for and love another human being, no one has to use guilt and shame to try to get us to take care or help that person. And unfortunately, in this era of climate change and environmental devastation, one of the primary tools that has been used to help motivate people to change, it's not one of two, are guilt and shame. And guilt and shame are terrible motivators. They make us shrink away. They make us more fearful. They make us divert to all the various addictive distractions that so many, if not all of us, are prone to these days. So as I see it, love, compassion, connection are far better motivators than guilt and shame. It's not a matter of looking at all the things we've done wrong. It's looking at all that is right in this world that we want to connect to, that we want to hold, that we want to care for, that we want to help sustain through our hearts. Okay? That's an important distinction when the relationship is heart-centered and not head-centered. Okay? Not grounded in all the garbage that passes through up here. Grounded in our deep emotions. So that then brings us to a whole new world of possibilities in responding. And for those of you, well, those of you who are wild foxes probably saw the video that Cal sent around this week about rewilding a forest. And those of you who are in the class will have the opportunity to see that because I've included it in the I won't dignify it by calling it a syllabus, but the course outline. And it's one woman in Sweden's response to seeing the destruction of the forest in her immediate environment. And it's beautiful and powerful. What it suggests to me is that the possibilities for the ways in which we can respond to what's going on in the world today are infinite. And they can be highly personal. They should be. You know, what you see in looking at that video is her connection with that forest, her deep love of all the plant beings, the trees. And the outgrowth of that is that she not just preserves, but renews that forest, creates new possibilities, creates deep healing. And so my hope is that all of us, as we engage with eco-spirituality, will choose to make our own responses. You know, one of the important concepts in Zen, if not the most important concept in Zen, is the concept of one body. The way that we see the world is that it is truly one body. In the same way that my head and my feet are all part of the same body, every aspect of this reality is not just connected, but part of the same thing. No separation. Now, once again, language fails. So various people have tried to create linguistic models to help understand this. One that's most commonly known is the one that Thich Nhat Hanh developed. And what he shows in his model is sort of a chain of causality. Okay, so you know, and everything is in fact created in a chain of causality, right? We have the sunlight and the rain and all of these aspects, and then the farmer, and then the seeds, and then the soil, and that, you know, and so on and so forth. And if we look at it that way, we see, oh my goodness, it takes a universe to create an ear of corn or whatever the thing is that we're, you know. But that is not quite it, because that is a chain of separate objects. And what the one body teaches us is it's all one great infinite object. That's not just hard to wrap our heads around, that's impossible to wrap our heads around. It's an experience. It can only be experienced. It cannot be reached by intellectual means. And again, that's true of so much in the realm of eco-spirituality. That's why the eco-spirituality class is based around a series of direct encounters rather than an elaborate series of readings or other means to help us understand. We cannot understand. It's ineffable, it's incomprehensible, and it's absolutely marvelous. Marvelous. The only way we can get there is to walk the path. You know, and one of the other things I talk about a little in the class is the necessity of suspending disbelief. We are hypercritical. We have been trained that way by this culture. Anything that seems magical, mysterious, kind of out of the ordinary is suspect. And on one hand, that has certain important utility. When somebody suggests that you should inject bleach to prevent COVID, you should be very skeptical. But when we're talking about spiritual experiences, when we're talking about direct encounters with wildness, when we're, talking about the deeper reality of this world, that skepticism doesn't serve us well. For those of you who are in the class and read the little preamble that I wrote, I mentioned my experience when I was living in Arizona, and my experience with my indigenous American friends that I had there. Because the biggest difference between them living in the indigenous culture, as much as that is possible in today's world, and me coming from the dominant culture colonizer perspective, was skepticism. Was skepticism. They regularly had experiences that we would call mysterious or magical or spiritual. I don't know. And to them, that was just part of ordinary reality. Of course. Of course, a raven can talk to you. Whereas we would attempt to deconstruct that, to analyze that, to bring to bear critical analysis, scientific analysis. And we would inevitably find some way to destroy that experience. So what I learned was that to step from one world to the other, all I had to do was stop being skeptical, to take things at face value, and to look deeply into the natural world. When we do that, amazing possibilities emerge. But don't inject the bleach. Okay, so why don't I pause here and see if folks have any questions or comments or observations.
Yesterday, I attended the memorial service of a good friend, and I was honored to give a talk there. And he was definitely a bodhisattva, and a bodhisattva with a beginner's mind, aided by a pretty good dose of ADHD, but beginner's mind nonetheless. And one of his brothers was talking, and he was saying that over the next few days, over the next week or so, as Andy is transitioning, his presence can be felt. And in the course of the memorial service, which was in his backyard in Scarborough on the marsh, and there were, a couple hundred people there. So during the course of the talks, which was really the only ceremony there was, at one point, a bald eagle went by, and someone pointed it out, and everything just stopped. The whole group was just silent, and we just took a minute of awe and then returned to what we were doing. And then there was also, as his son was talking, there was a little bird that landed on the tree next to his son. And that bird stayed there the whole time during that talk. And then the third one was so across the marsh in the far distance is the railroad. And the Downeaster travels up and down that track. And as soon as the talks were concluded and there was a moment of silence, a passenger train headed down the tracks into the distance. So they were just three amazing moments that I think most people there experienced, which describing them doesn't really catch what was underneath, the feelings that were underneath. And one of my questions today was going to be your take on this concept of feeling Andy's presence in this time so close to his death.
Ah, such a simple question. Thank you. I want to first go to what you described is a perfect example of what I was just talking about, in the sense that we could ascribe all the things you just talked about to coincidence. Oh, it's a coincidence the eagle flew by. It's a coincidence a bird landed on a tree. It's a coincidence the train came by, as it did. Or again, we can see the magic, the mystery, the whatever word you want to ascribe to it, in these things happening at that time. Again, my indigenous American friends would have no question. Of course, that eagle was a sign. Of course, that bird was telling us something. Yeah, they'd have a little problem with the Amtrak, nor whatever it's called down easter. But that said, you know, to some extent, the universe is what we create it to be, which is a whole other interesting kind of area that I'm not going to get into the rabbit hole. I'm not going to go down in this particular conversation. But so it's a perfect example, and those of you who are there, I'm guessing, had a very intrinsic experience, the kind of thing that brings tears to your eyes. Emotion just wells up in you. Another, to me, another indication. Our hearts know. Our heads doubt, but our hearts know. Right? And eco-spirituality is very much of our heart. Most of the people on this planet do not locate themselves here. That's an artifact of our Western European evolved culture. Many places in the rest of the world, you say, where are you located? They'll point to their heart, or they'll point to their hara, their dantian, their center, but we locate ourselves up here, which is kind of another interesting artifact. So we tend to value cognitive reactions over emotional reactions. And I think that's an important reorientation if we are going to survive. Now, as to what may or may not have been true about Andy's presence, in Buddhism, classic Buddhism, there's an assumption that the person's, I'm going to go to word, essence is around for several days after they pass. So classical Buddhist thinking would say, yeah, absolutely. His presence is there. But I think if we go to this idea of the one body, nothing is ever lost and nothing is ever gained. Everything is always present. And that's a kind of a radical notion. Yes, this individual ego, this self that I think that I am, that we think that we are, comes and goes, no doubt. But if we understand one body, if we understand that we are manifestations of one body, then there's no coming and going. Okay.
Peter, the beginning of your talk and throughout, I was reminded of a comment by a 20th century English philosopher who said that all the problems of philosophy are problems of language. And which is sort of ironic for a thinker to say, because language is the currency they use to express their notions, although this philosopher started turning to mathematics, which is a whole other conversation. But the point I'm trying to get to here is that my own personal struggle is to set aside the skepticism that you mentioned, because my inclination, as you say, the Western culture's inclination is to nonetheless just try to wrestle with these problems with language. And, the simple sentence that all the problems are problems of language. It's very easy to sort of, for me, to nod my head and say, yeah, that kind of makes sense, because we'll wrestle with these ideas for thousands of years, but get to no resolution. Just indicates the problems of language. But for me, the wrestling is really setting aside that habitual desire to nonetheless tackle the problems with language, even though in this part, I might know better, but this part is definitely dominant, which I guess is the essence of the practice. That's all I wanted to add.
Thank you. You know, we create so many of our own problems. And I want to take an example that's kind of remote from eco-spirituality as it was, but it's something that I've been reading about really recently. And that is that one of the things that scientists are saying is that there's no such thing as race. We have created race. Yes, people have different skin tones, but race as a construct is a falsehood. All human beings are the same biologically. And so we've created our own problem, because in our heads we said, oh, you know, this is this and this is that. We've given them all names and labels and so on and so forth. And then we've divided up according to those lines. And we've had conflicts and wars and all sorts of horrible things as a result of that construct, which is not real, right? It's a complete illusion from the perspective of scientists and biologists. So that's kind of, in some ways, it's sort of an extreme example, but it's a good example of how when we are doing with our minds is not penetrating reality, it's distorting reality to a great extent. And by the way, eco-spirituality is not unique in dealing with this problem, because all spirituality deals with this problem, right? It's, you know, if you have an experience of God or goddess, again, whatever language we choose to use, that experience can't be reduced to words. It's just impossible. Okay. So we use words to approximate. We use words to try to explain to other people what we've encountered. But those words are always introducing a fallacy. So that's a fundamental conundrum in spirituality, right? In all spirituality, not just eco-spirituality. Is it, Lao Tzu said, I think it is, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. As soon as we open our mouths, we're wrong.
Some 20 years ago, I was a member of a Zendo in New Rochelle, New York, which is a busy metropolitan area. And right next to the Zendo was a 2-car parking lot that we had converted into a garden, which meant everything was in pots. And then seeds sort of got into cracks in the asphalt, so there were things that grew. I'm telling you that so you'll know what happened next. And it's similar to Susan's experience. We had a man who came to the Zendo maybe a half dozen times. We didn't really know him. One morning after the morning service, the teacher told us that his wife had died, and he had asked if we would have a service for her. She had never set foot in the Zendo. We agreed, and he and the family came maybe a half hour later. They had never set foot in the place. We didn't know them from Adam. We did our service. The windows of the Zendo were open, and birds had come into the little garden next door. They always came, but that morning it was extraordinary. There was so much bird activity that there were times that they were as loud as the chants. And invariably, one would come to the window and sit. This meant absolutely nothing to those of us who were members of the Sangha. It wasn't until the service was over that the family members told us that the wife, whose death we were memorializing, had loved birds, had been passionately involved with birds all of her life. And for them, her presence was there vividly in the experience of all those birds. And it made the hair on the back of our neck stand up. We had been unaware, but we certainly could understand that they would feel it that way in that strange place with its strange service. Here was this familiar presence that was for them, that woman.
Thank you, Margaret. What a powerful story. I mean, I teared up a little bit. It's just so powerful. As the two stories we've just heard suggest, there are more things under heaven and earth, Horatio, than we will ever know. And so for those of you who are going forward with this course, I offer you the invitation to embrace the mysterious, to enter the mystery, and discover all that life has to offer for you. Thank you very much.